Dr Bianchini. Professor Bianchini teaches at the University of Bologna and is a renowned expert on Southeastern Europe. We are very glad to have him in Corinth. It's his first time here, but we have a long cooperation with him. Our department, together with other 9 universities, from the London School of Economics to the University of Bologna, we offer a master's program in Sarajevo, Bosnia, and in Bologna, Italy, with where Nicholas Tsifakis is teaching now, with many other colleagues from all over Europe. And this is a very successful program, which is financed by the European Union and the Italian government. And some of the graduates have become very important people, among them the ambassador of Bosnia in the United Nations, and so on. So we are very glad to have Stefano here, and looking forward to his lecture, which is on redrawing
the lessons not learned from the resolution of Yugoslavia.
Yes, on the Western Balkans, and redrawing international boundaries and the future of the region, which is important both for Italy and for Greece. So
thank you. Thank you, Asteris, for your kind invitation. I'm glad to see you. I will focus in my presentation on 3 main aspects that, at least in my view, can be identified to lessons not learned from the process of Yugoslav dismemberment. And probably you might be surprised to see some unexpected or expected similarities with the process of European integration and the problems that European integration is facing, particularly since the moment when the project, the political and economic project of EU integration entered into crisis since 2005. And I will elaborate further about this topic. So, in a sense, what I wanted to say is that by reconsidering some of the main aspects that follow, let's say, the developments in Yugoslavia, particularly in the 80s, can offer problematic insights for considerations, particularly in contexts where multicultural, multinational dimension is predominant in the relationships within this space. Well, I will focus mainly on 3 aspects, 3 main lessons not learned, in my view, from the Yugoslav dismemberment. And I will also connect some of these issues with the crisis of the European Union. The first not learned lessons is, in my view, connected to the length of the economic crisis and the impact that this length may have in a multicultural, multinational context. As you know, Yugoslavia started, the crisis of Yugoslavia began with a deep economic crisis beginning of the 80s. And this crisis began with an international state indebtment. This indebtment was, let's say, the measure of this indebtment was to a large extent unknown to the authorities in Belgrade till the moment when the representative of IMF came to Belgrade to discuss how to reconsider the indebtment and to pay it, saying that the indebtment was around $20 billion at the time. The government was not aware of that, because according to the government, the indebtedness was maximum $12 billion. So the two elements, let's say, data were not consistent, and the government needed some time for making a check and see whether what was right, what was wrong. Yeah, and then they discovered that actually the indebtedness was $20 billion, for the simple reason that the republics had the opportunity, according to the Constitution of 1974, to make their own loans without asking permission to the federal government. So the federal government was ignoring the total amount of the debt. What was the consequence of that? They decided to apply restrictive measures, budgetary restrictive measures, by closing down the reducing imports and passing austerity measures. This is something that sounds known, yeah? No. So this is quite surprising if you consider that Yugoslavia was a socialist country. But Yugoslavia, and this is a very important point, was not a closed country. Actually, it was an open economy, because Yugoslavia had lots of contacts, not only with the Western world, but particularly with the post-colonial countries. So the non-aligned, because of the non-aligned movement, Yugoslavia had lots of contacts with countries from the so-called, at the time, Third World, because Yugoslavia was participating, even for instance, in building ships, or for Saudi Arabia, for Ethiopia, for India. So Yugoslavia had an open economy under many respects. So by applying these rules, these austerity measures, they affected, on the one hand, the standard of life of the population, a standard of life that increased in the 60s and the 70s. So this created lots of disappointment, but also excluded Yugoslavia from one of the key economic and technological transformation, the introduction of the IT communication and the computer system, because this was the period when this started. So these measures were very detrimental psychologically and economically for the country. And this created also a great, let's say, disappointment first, and the resentment, because they didn't see how the mechanism, how the solution, how the way out was possible to be designed. And you see, this aspect is, to a large extent, connected to the second lessons not learned, namely the role of the governance. When you have to make decisions, how the mechanism, the political mechanism, is working in a context when you have to take decisions rapidly, in a short time. You have to consider that in Yugoslavia, in addition to the austerity measures and the problem of the repayment of the debt, the question of collecting currency for paying the IMF, and was connected also to a huge inflation. This inflation, at a certain point, the beginning of the year was, let's say, 10%, the end of the year was 50%. Then when the new year began with 50%, at the end of the year, of the next year, was 100%. So this is just to explain that the process of economy and the degradation of the economy was very fast. And the point was how the political system was able to make appropriate decisions. And this was the point connected to governance, because the mechanism required the agreement of the Sixth Republic and the two autonomous regions, so the 8 units of the federation. Yugoslavia was based on ethnic ratio and ethnic representation of the republics and regions at the federal level into the federal government and the different administrative bodies, let's say, because it was a deeply decentralized country. So this means that for each decisions, they needed to have the consensus. They used this word, but actually this was an indirect right of veto, because through the consensus, the unanimity vote, they could make a decision. Now imagine in a government whose members, ministries, were selected on the basis of a clear balance, ethnic balance, so, or let's say Republican balance. So if you have the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Croatia, this means that the Minister of Domestic Affairs should be from Slovenia, and the Minister of Finances should be from Montenegro, and then, so this kind of balance, which sounds similar, yeah, to the mechanism how the members of the Commission are selected by EU member states. So they are represented. And the mechanism also required a consensus. So they had to make a decision in agreement, in full agreement. If one of these representatives would not support the decision, the whole mechanism, decision-making process was stopped. Just to give you another example, the federal parliament was different than the European Parliament, in the sense that in terms of decision-making process, in the sense that the federal parliament was set up by a representative of, let's say, 30 members from each republic and 12 members from the regions, the autonomous regions. But this difference was meaningless, because actually the majority was not based on the majority of the members of the chamber, as it happens into the European Union, for example, European Parliament, but in each of the Republican delegations. So this means that in order to pass a decision of the Parliament, the Croatian delegation was set up by 30 people, ethnically representing the different groups, but in any case, they needed to vote within these 30, so that 16 was the majority. And this represented one vote. This was replicated in all the other 7 units in addition. So this means that you needed 8 votes, 8 yes. This means not a majority of the members voting regardless from their own nationality, but with a single majority within each of the units. In this way, because this was considered a guarantee towards the interest of the single republics and the regions. Now, within the context of the long economic crisis, the policymakers were induced, or they were inclined to support support and protect, if possible, the economy of their own territory. And this gradually led to an economic nationalism, which disintegrated the internal market, because the policymakers were interested to protect the economy within a certain context, rather than to see the global interest of the whole country. And this became increasingly relevant by the time passing. The more the crisis deepened, the more this behavior was rooted into the policymakers of the republics. Just to give you an example, I remember that at the beginning of the 80s, a center of research of that time, Centro Cardel, invited me to a conference that took place in Maribor, in Slovenia. And this conference was exactly, already at that time, 82 was, about economic nationalism in Yugoslavia. So they didn't use this terminology. They used another terminology because at the time it was better not to be direct. Yeah? So they had a different terminology, but more or less, despite the language, this was the substance. The substance was that the party and the political party, the communists, and the scholars started to be concerned about this mechanism of gradual isolation of the single units of the country. In addition, you have to consider that the mechanism understood that reforms were necessary. So they created commissions, big commissions, in particular two big commissions. One was led by a Slovenian leader, Krajger, and the other one was led by a Croatian leader, Vrhovec. So there were two main commissions, one for the economic reforms and the other one for the political reforms, because the leaders understood that they had to make reforms in both these realms. They couldn't agree. They met for years, several times, but it was impossible for them to find a common language, because the interests of the Republic diverged, and the more the crisis deepened, the interest diverged accordingly, and because on the other hand, they were also, let's say, constrained by the ideological framework, which was connected to the fact that they could not accept a drastic reduction of the welfare. But the quality of the welfare, in any case, was reducing. So this means that the general context was showing a reducing role of the governance, and the fact that population trust less and less the mechanism of governance. And if you consider from this point of view, you see that this had an impact on the power legitimation. Because in all communist societies, legitimation came from ideology. This, whatever the ideology might mean, so in Moscow or self-management for Yugoslavia. But self-management was one of the key ideological issues for the country. Now, in this context, as you can understand, when the economic crisis is continuing and the mechanism of decision making was so slow in making the decision, so even when they were able to make a decision after a long negotiation, because they negotiated, and as policymakers, so at the end of the year, let's say, they negotiated a certain set of measures. But these measures were the outcome of negotiation, considering the situation, the economic situation at the beginning of the year, when, let's say, the inflation was 10%, but at the end of the year was 50%. So the decision that they negotiated in the end were not enough effective, considering the new economic context in the country. On the other hand, for this reason, it was increasingly less relevant, the role of ideology, because self-management appeared to be powerless in this context. And because of that, the policymakers, the political bureaucracy, started to think that a different legitimation was necessary. And this is in order to preserve themselves and to be re-elected, because this is the point. They tried to support increasingly the interest of the territory by saying that they were representing people. And in this case, the local people, not the people as a whole. And so in this way, gradually, the national interest replaced the broader interest of the context of Yugoslavia. And this led, in a sense, to the third point, if you can see. So the length of the crisis, together with an ineffective mechanism of governance, at a certain point encouraged the political framework to insist on the interest of the territories in order to be elected, to appear to the population as the protector, the savior of the context, and claiming radical reforms by charging the others to be the responsible of the crisis. So this appeared evident, particularly in Serbia. But also in other republics was more or less the same attitude. Because if Serbia began to elaborate, particularly with the famous memorandum of the Academy of Science in Belgrade, that Serbia was the victim of Yugoslavia. Because Serbia had two autonomous regions, completely autonomous, so that its own, let's say, role was diminished because any other republic had this kind of political constraints in terms also of recognition of the territory, of the rule of law, and so on. So this was one of the main. Then they insisted on saying that the Albanians of Kosovo were discriminating the Serbs, and this discrimination was occurring in Bosnia and in Croatia. It doesn't matter now if it's true or not. What is relevant is the impact on the public opinion of this kind of opinion, and particularly to what extent these kind of ideas were at a certain point used by politics in order to push for changes, for radical changes. Now, this kind of victimization that was politically referring was, in a sense, also connected to the idea that, for instance, this was widely spread in Croatia and Slovenia, that the solidarity towards the backward regions was, in a sense, meaningless because the money was badly used, because the backward countries had leadership that were unable to use in an effective way the money, so the money was spent for nothing or was misused in Belgrade. And this way they confused the role of Belgrade as the capital of the federation as a capital of Serbia. And so Belgrade was the responsible of everything. On the other hand, this is curious because the Serbs charged the Slovenians to be the responsible of the economic crisis because the Slovenians had the Ministry of Finance and the governor of the Yugoslav Bank. So for this reason, they said the whole economy is on the hand of the Slovenians, so the Slovenians have the responsibility of the collapse of the economy of Yugoslavia. So this is a mechanism that, as you can understand, creates a conflict between North and South, between backwarded and developed regions, affected the solidarity, and particularly inculcate into the population that the responsibility is only on the others. Now, at this point, you have the third step, the third lesson to learn. What can happen in these conditions? To what extent, at a certain point, if there are no effective reforms and no restoration of the economy, it might happen that at a certain point, one policymakers or some policymakers decide that it is possible to force the rules in order to make the change possible. This is exactly what Milosevic did. But by doing this, this was also based on the idea of the restructuring relationships in terms of nationalities, by mobilizing the population on the terms of the national solidarity against the others, rejecting the others. Now, if you look, making still the differences within the European Union, you have a sovereign debt, a crisis that is very prolonged, and this is not only an economic crisis, it's also a political crisis. because the crisis of the idea of the European Union began with the rejection of the Constitutional Treaty in 2005 by France and the Netherlands. This was the beginning of the political crisis. Because if you start to think about it, there was a moment when the European project was particularly innovative. And this was the period that goes from 1993, Copenhagen criteria, and 2004, the enlargement, the first big enlargement of the 10 countries. Between these two periods, there was, despite all the different position of the countries, some reluctances, okay, this happened, but still there was a period in which the idea to make changes by including new member states within the European Union was connected to the idea of transforming the institution of the European Union. It was not by chance, for instance, that in 1992 Maastricht Treaty was signed, and this Maastricht Treaty envisaged the citizenship, the European citizenship, and the creation of the common currency. And this is to a large extent connected to the process of dismembering of Yugoslavia, despite of the fact that this is not recognized in the literature. I was very surprised to see, for instance, lots of international literature speaking about the enlargement eastwards without considering the impact of the Yugoslav dismemberment. But this had a great impact. And I will give you some examples. First of all, the fact that when Yugoslavia began to collapse in 1991, during the beginning of the war, Germany was pushing for the recognition of Slovenia and Croatia. So, France was opposing and was considering the idea of supporting Serbia. While at the same time, the unification of Germany induced France to think that it was possible to establish good relations with Poland and Russia. Not only Soviet Union, but Russia after 1992, which remind us what happened after before the two world wars, during and between the two world wars, and after. So at a certain point they realized it has to be recognized that Mitterrand recognized that this would lead to a very dramatic potential consequences, and they decided to sign the Maastricht Treaty. It's not by chance that this happened together with the recognition of Slovenia and Croatia in agreement, all member states. You can discuss whether this was a good decision or not, but this was in any case connected to the fact that they had to preserve the unity of the Union. This was the first point. Second point was that immediately after that, in 1992, there was the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the war in Transnistria, because there was a secession of the Russian, the Ukrainian from Moldavia, with the participation of the 14 corps of the Russian army. There was the war for Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And most problematic, there was a clear a public statement of the president of Hungary, Montal, who claimed that if for any reason, because there were rumors about that, Moldavia will join Romania, Hungary will raise the issue of Trianon, opening the issue of Transylvania. This could have led Eastern Europe to wars, to a set of wars. What happened? This is something that again is ignored by the literature, and in my view is an extremely important point that occurred. And this was the Bayadour initiative. The Prime Minister of France, Bayadour, suggested a stability pact for East Central Europe, under which the potential of the time, potential or interested countries to become candidate and then to join the European Union should sign bilateral and multilateral agreement with the European Union, by rejecting violence in changing borders and respecting minorities and including minorities in their own political process and system. At the beginning, this idea was received, welcomed with some reluctances in all the countries, particularly Poland, Czech Republic, and so on. But actually, this declaration entered into the Copenhagen criteria, and particularly in the first Copenhagen criteria, a few months later, because in 1993, as I mentioned to you, in the first criterion is explicitly said that in order to apply for the European membership, countries should respect minorities, in addition to have a democratic system, multi-party system, blah, blah, blah. First. Secondly, the countries had to negotiate, because this happened. And actually in Paris, in 1995, in April, so this means some months before the Dayton Agreement, the interested country came to Paris and they signed 98 treaties, bilateral treaties, and multilateral treaties with the European Union under the conditions that Balladur designed in 1992. And if you look geographically, the countries that signed this agreement, from Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, from Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, including Albania, you see that this was a process of isolating the nationalist virus of war in Yugoslavia. Slovenia was not invited. This only the other countries were. And they signed. This was an extremely important point, because after that the whole process of transformation began, and this is explained to you why then the decision that had been made in Maastricht were reinforced with the Amsterdam Treaty. The Eurozone started to be established. The common citizenship envisaged a new framework, and within this framework it was outlined the idea of establishing a convention for a constitutional treaty, which means that the whole process that I was mentioning of transforming by enlarging the European Union was also connected to the idea of creating a governance that was, let's say, able to afford the transformation, because the European Union was had still the institution when we had only six member states, and then now they were prospectively being more than 30. So this was the process. This process was stopped, as I told you, in 2005. After signing the constitutional treaty, this was not ratified. This is the beginning of the idea, of the crisis of the idea. And within this framework, the policymaker had to reconsider this kind of governance when the 2008 crisis erupted. Sovereign debt, as you know, length of the crisis, austerity measures applied, restrictive measures applied, a great social impact, particularly in certain countries in the south of Europe or in Western Europe, from Ireland to Greece, as you know. Now, this situation is still connected to the inability of transforming the whole institutions of the European Union, because we have a Eurozone, but we don't have a common fiscal policy, we don't have an economic policy, despite of the fact that the majority of the orientation is connected to this neoliberal budgetary policy in terms of economy. But you have also divisions between North and South. There were ideas, fortunately for the moment only within certain environments, of creating two euros, the euro for the North and the euro for the South, for instance, or to have and the question of solidarity is still, let's say, on the agenda. To what extent this solidarity should be applied or not replied, what does it mean to take into consideration the debt of the others. And what is also interesting is that Yugoslavia, in 1981, as I told you, had a debt of $20 billion. At the end of the decade, before the beginning of the war, they have repaid the rates for an amount of $20 billion, but the debt of $20 billion was still there. So they paid double. And you know that this is again the problem for other countries, including Greece, that the debts increased rather than diminished. Now, what can happen in these conditions? What are the lessons learned from these issues? It's clear that Yugoslavia, because it was a socialist country, because they were communist, they were from the Balkans, they are violent, they are bad guys, whatever you want, all the bias can be used in this case, and this was, let's say, marginalized and not considered, despite the fact that Badinter suggested a strong measure that had an impact at that time, because it hindered, for instance, the possibility of the war in Yugoslavia to be spread in other contexts. But still, then in this situation, you see that the difficulties of the member state to find a common language, to establish a process of integration further, while within the European Union there are again increasing orientation that trend to exclude the others because they are considered a threat into the process of European integration. This means I'm referring here to the feelings of racist feelings, xenophobia, anti-Semitism that are spreading into Europe in connection to the idea of excluding the migrants, rejecting the mobility of the people under Schengen. And Schengen, if you consider this, was really and is for Europe really a revolution, a cultural revolution, a deep cultural revolution, for one simple reason, because Schengen challenged for the first time in a radical way one of the principles of the Westphalian sovereignty, the fact that a sovereign has the control over a fixed population. The fixed population within the European Union do not exist any longer within the nation state because people move. People have the right to move and have the right to find a job in another country, and after 5 years living in another country can also participate in the local elections. So this is something that is this changing our mindset, because we have been used in the last 200 years to think only in terms of the borders of our nation state. All of us, we have been educated in our schools and university for 200 years that the end of history is the establishment of our nation state. And through this mechanism, something deeply has changed. And this is this showing that the process of, I would like to use, and I like to use Zygmunt Bauman reference, the liquefaction of the nation state is underway. Under many respects. For instance, not only Schengen, but even Erasmus is doing that. Because the mobility of the students is the requirement of the fact that the student should know more languages. These affect the standardized uniqueness of language of the nation state. And this is just one example, but you can consider also lots of other examples connected to the development of medicine, the changes in terms of demography and birth rates, the changes in terms of what a family is. All these elements that were connected to the uniqueness in terms of language, of culture, of identity, in terms of sexuality, in terms of family and family. This is underway to be, let's say, to becoming increasingly fluid. This fluidity is showing that we are already living in a post-national state, but the reluctance is to accept this. Also, or because they are policymakers without a, let's say, political tools able to manage these differences that are increasingly characterize our societies. Because they have to cope with the crisis, economic crisis. They want to protect their own territory, their own space. Their reaction can be detrimental in the sense that can increase the critical situation rather than to solve. Becomes a problem rather than a solution. Instead of looking how to manage the diversity for the future, they try to re-establish an homogeneity that doesn't exist any longer, and that you cannot see even in the individual or in the family context. And this can have a dramatic impact on the future of the European Union if the European Union does not transform the institutions according to the context. And this is in effect what happened in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia didn't want to adapt the constitution, the framework to the new context. What is maybe also interesting to consider is that no one in the West, in the moment when communism was collapsing, pretended democratic multi-party elections in Yugoslavia. And this made possible to have two different, let's say, power. One was the power of the republics that was based on the free and fair elections, more or less, in all the republics. So this legitimized differently the local leaderships, while in the parliament and the government, even the local leaders opposed the political election, multi-party election, because it was easier for them to say this is the parliament of the communists. So it is the old, representing the old world that we want to destroy. And so this ideological bias had a great impact in avoiding the possibility of transforming a socialist federation into a democratic federation. And this is another element that explains, to a large extent, the reluctances of policymakers, even today, to think in new terms what is behind the nation-state experience. And this explains why the EU crisis is not just an economic crisis, but it is a political crisis. It can become also a political cultural crisis. And within this framework, fortunately, the situation is still open, so there are possibilities to move to different directions. But in this case, the lessons that are not learned from Yugoslavia should be considered with a different careful attention in order to avoid a scenario that otherwise can be a scenario for Europe. And just to conclude, don't forget what Joschka Fischer said in 2000 at the Humboldt University when he explained, he as a Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, the reasons of enlargement to the professors and the students at that time. If you can easily download the speech because it is on the website, and you will find that he mentioned first that it's absolutely important to include these areas of East Central Europe into the framework of the European Union in order to guarantee peace. And he shows Yugoslavia as an example. If you leave this country outside, you never know what can happen and what can be the impact of this destabilization for the future of the European integration. So he connected the expansion with the need of transforming the European Union by explaining why we should have two chambers, a presidency, and he elaborated his own ideas. It doesn't matter the details, but what is important is the connection. So he was aware about this. So this is something that should require a specific, not only scholarly attention, but also a political attention, because this is something that we can learn from the past in order to avoid certain detrimental developments that can affect our own future. Thank you for your attention.
rounds of questions. Please raise your hand, identify yourself. We'll give to Professor Bianchini each time 5 minutes to reply, and then we'll wrap it up. So, I would like first to pose a question. Please.
I am Professor Bianchini, and well, first of all, thank you very much for this very interesting, I should dare to say, methodological framework of trying to see what could potentially happen in Europe if we don't learn from the lessons not learned in Western Balkans. Nevertheless, I think that the issue of the financial crisis, especially the debt issue of 20 billion, I think it's probably overestimated, considering, as you have said, that the Yugoslav economy was an open economy, and B, since such variables are can also be seen on absolute terms, meaning 20 billion is a big amount, but nevertheless, it can also be assessed on a comparative basis. For example, the growth rate of Yugoslavia those days, and the capability of the state to repay the debt. So, I think that the Yugoslav economy those days was performing quite well. I fully agree with you that there has been this imbalance between North and South, which have been creating internal disputes and so on. But still, it's an issue, how big or how heavy this debt was. And by saying this A point, I go to the B point, and this is where I want your reaction. To what extent, if we give emphasis on the fiscal debt, then we underestimate other influences on the ground, including predominant interethnic and conflict relations, probably external influences, and other kind of national interests or ethnic interests as expressed those days.
Thank you. Any other questions? Please.
Hi. Thank you very much for your speech. My name is Christiana Kirkou. I am a student at the Mediterranean Studies program. I would like to ask, could we draw a link, or maybe you already implied, with Belgrade and the dual role it had and the confusion it created as the capital of Serbia and at the same time the center of the federal government. Could we draw a link with Germany and its role as a state and the promotion of its national interest as an EU member, and at the same time its role as the most powerful economic center of EU, and the confusion that this creates in the negotiations? This is one question, and if I may also ask, if we accept that EU is in a Yugoslavian road, or that some factors at least are common, what is your suggestion to avoid this track, and not in a scholarship terms, but in more concrete political steps? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, let's give you 5 minutes to reply to this.
Okay, for the first question about, I perfectly agree with the fact that it's not only a question of fiscal debt that can have an impact in disarticulating the society. But definitely the economic crisis and the differences that began to be developed or emphasized by offer a good room for the development of interethnic conflicts. Also because this allowed policy to use them. Because one thing is the feelings, let's say, that remains such in within the society, because it's impossible to destroy, let's say, racism on interethnic bias. But they remain dormant. They are sleeping within the society unless political movements mobilized. This is the point. Now, when this can happen, what can be the impact of this? This is something that is extremely important. And you see, for instance, in Europe, we have in this moment different feelings in these terms, not only in terms of ethnic, anti-European, racist. Imagine, for instance, because this is deeply presented also in Italy, just to make a clear example. Imagine what can happen, what can be the impact on the future of the European Union if for all these disappointments, meetings, Marine Le Pen becomes the next president of France. This is not something that can be excluded. And what can be the impact in the relationship with Germany, with the European Union? This is something that, because till the moment when you have let's say, a conservative or radical conservative government, take for instance an example Orban in Hungary, this is the periphery. It's different when it happens in the center. There are other elements that can create concern for the future. For instance, the decision of Cameron to have a referendum for the way out from the European Union in the UK. A referendum that, if happens, and if creates the conditions for the UK to go out from the European Union, is not only a precedent or an element that can affect the European Union, but can have effect also on the United Kingdom, because you cannot exclude, as the newspapers are already reporting, a new referendum in Scotland for the independence, because they don't want to follow the Englishness. Because in this case, the question of going out from the European Union is not connected to Britishness, but to Englishness. And so, because the UKIP is pushing in this sense, but UKIP is weak in Scotland, extremely weak in Scotland. So this is something that can have an impact in the dynamics, because even the processes of integration, disintegration within Europe have a different level. One is the level of the European Union, for instance, UK going out. The other one is within the European Union. Think, for instance, Scotland, think within the member state, Catalonia, País Vascos, Flemish areas in Belgium. And what is interesting, all these events are affecting the Western Europe, but in the moment when you have a referendum in Scotland, it doesn't. It is unclear why this referendum should not be allowed to Catalonia, or if you want to Republika Srpska, as Dodik is claiming. It's difficult to say no. And why? And if you consider the referendum in Crimea and what has been the impact in the relationships with Russia, this can offer additional elements, because we can, as professor, make all the distinctions from this point of view. But from the political point of view, when you speak about the policymakers, this kind of distinctions between theoretical aspect, different local differences, peculiar cases, this is something very, very problematic. Suffice here to remind that when the United States insisted to say that Kosovo is a special case, Putin replied, also Abkhazia, Ossetia, and Crimea are special cases. And now try to define what is a special case, and try to find the agreement of everybody. This is a special case, this is not a special case. This is one of the key points that can affect the whole mechanism of the future of Europe. And so this goes far beyond the economic crisis. Economic crisis just can open, like you can, like the fire. Yes, exactly. And then other elements are coming, and this is particularly connected to politics, because this is the responsibility of the political leaders, because they can mobilize, they can speak to emotion rather than to the rational, and they can mobilize a certain consensus under certain contexts. So this is a huge responsibility they have, And I'm not so sure that they are aware of that, because most of the policymakers think that, okay, but we can manage in any case, or we can control. But not necessarily you can control everything. Even Milosevic was sure that he will be able to control all the Serbs, and this didn't happen, because at a certain point Karadzic rejected the Van-Sowen plan. And this led Milosevic, as you know, to apply some sanctions against Republika Srpska during the war in 1994. So this is just, the situation can, not necessarily policymakers can then control, but they think that they can control. And this is very delicate situation. Oh, just to speak to Christian about your question. You know, there is a key difference between the situation in Serbia and the situation for Germany. In Serbia, this is true, there were two roles of Belgrade. And it's true that there was at a certain point, it is to be said, an interest of the three main republics to put an end to the federation. This was a joint decision of the Slovenian, Croatian, and Serbian leaders that met separately into two meetings, one in January and one in March 1991. In January it was between the Slovenian and the Serbian delegation, in March between Slovenian and Croatian. And they decided to dissolve the federation. So the use of the two Belgrades was let's say, a manipulation used just to mobilize the people, just to make this kind of confusion between the two roles of the government, because no one of these three leaders were interested to preserve the joint federal government any longer in the future. In addition, Serbia wanted to have a specific role by changing the maps within Yugoslavia, by including certain territory of Croatia and Bosnia for specific ideological and ethno-national reasons. You don't have this in Germany. Germany is a very peculiar country in this sense, because it is a reluctant leader of the European Union. They don't take the responsibility of the leadership that they have in this moment, de facto, because their own, let's say, particularly connection with France is weakening, because France is weakening, and the role of also Hollande, or the successor of France, is weakening in comparison with the role of Germany. Then there is a Germany that is coping also with their own mindset. In their own mindset, and this is typical, I think this is a sign in political culture, the notion of debt in German means guilt, is the same word. And mentally, this is something that has a tremendous impact, because this is connected to the Weimar experience, this is connected also to their own experience, responsibility towards the world because of Nazi Germany. So guilty, to be guilty, and to have a debt, this is something that is very problematic for Germany. So Germany is a country that is taking certain leading role, and you can see, for instance, in a clear way when Merkel and Hollande met Poroshenko and Putin in order to make some decisions about the future of Ukraine. Now, if you look from this point of view, you see, no one of the European Union leaders were invited, nor Mogherini, neither Tusk, nor Juncker, first. Secondly, Hollande was just because Mrs. Merkel bring him here, there, but this was a facade. Poroshenko was absolutely irrelevant. The only dialogue was between Merkel and Putin. Yeah, this is a clear sign that they have a leadership in this moment in Europe. But they are also reluctant to play the responsibility that is stemming from them towards the others, because they feel themselves still, let's say, reluctant to play a role that can be interpreted differently into So this is the paradox in Europe, where you have a powerful country that is reluctant to play a role that implies responsibilities toward the others. So this is the difference, in my view, between well, Serbia didn't want to take any responsibility toward Yugoslavia, but Serbia wanted to change the map of Yugoslavia, and to a certain extent in agreement with Tudjman, because they made the agreement. They tried, at least, to make the agreement for dividing Bosnia. You don't have anything similar in Europe in this moment, fortunately. And this gives hopes that there is room for going into a different direction.
Any other questions?
Yes?
Please.
Do you believe that we have learned any lesson regarding the economic crisis in terms of the European Union institutions and structure? Or is it, let's say, a work in progress?
What do you mean exactly?
Regarding the economic crisis, have we learned any lesson in terms of the European Union institutions and structure? Or is it something that, let's say, we will find out after a decade or so?
Second option.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Please.
As an undergraduate student, you said about the politicians are focusing on national interest in Yugoslavia. I want to ask, in relation to the European Union, if the political crisis influence politicians to focus on national interest, or the national interest they focus are influence the political crisis? If the focus they give the politicians on national interests influence the political crisis.
This influence the
Yes.
Please.
Do you think that there is any relation from the fact that Serbia is an Orthodox country and Slovenia and Croatia are the Protestant Catholic countries more close to the Europe, which are ruled by the Germans or the French or these Western, more related Protestant and Catholic countries? Can we put the religion in terms of the progress that affected the communication and the acceptance of these countries in the Europe?
Thank you. Any other question? Please.
Well, about your question, I give you the second option, in the sense that I don't see, at least at the moment, the will to make reforms in the economic structure of the European Union. And actually, if you look from this point of view, the only leader that is making certain decisions that only to a certain extent belong to his responsibility is Draghi. And Draghi is insisting on the side of, okay, but you cannot rely only on me, you have to make reforms. And these reforms are not only connected to the national reform, but he is complaining that there is a need for reforms at the European level, which, however, affect the little interest of the policymakers. Which is not the question of something, the little interest, because it's obvious that if you increase the powers of the European Union, the leaders in the European Union will have a better and greater role than the local leaders. And so it's obvious that leaders might be reluctant to cede this power. But actually they are losing power in any case, because the little nation states are reducing their own role. If we are competing increasingly into the globalized world, where China is playing a relevant role. Imagine just this issue. China needs every year, for demographic reason, 20 million new jobs. How many Greece? 3, maybe 2 or 3 Greece. So every year, because of the expansion. So this is the question, why they are, where we are competing. How can we compete in these conditions? even Germany without will be unable to compete under these conditions. So, and this is, however, the inability of the policymaker to understand that they need courage in these terms. And what they should think is exactly to start to think in a different way how they can develop a joint strategy in terms of fiscal policy and in terms of economic policy. But this will inevitably transfer the sovereignty at the broader level, because you have to compete at the broader level. And this is not a reduction in sovereignty, but simply a share in sovereignty at a different level. I give you an example, just to remain with this. Many years ago, I remember during a summer school that was related to the processes of the Euro integration, we had a minister of Italy, and students from, I don't remember, Poland, Czech Republic, raised the issue why you are preparing to abandon lira, because lira means that you are losing sovereignty, because you are entering into something else that you cannot control. And the minister replied, no, it's exactly the contrary. Because in this moment with the lira, our governor of the Bank of Italy, every day when he wants to know the rate of lira, he has to open the newspaper and read what the Deutsche Mark is doing. On the basis of this, he makes decision. So he has no possibility to influence the decision of the Deutsche Bank. But if we share the power within, because we are in the same board with other people at the broader level, we acquire in sovereignty rather than in losing sovereignty, because we participate in a decision that illusionally we think that we have with the lira, but actually we don't have. So this is an interesting argument just to explain where is the courage necessary for the policymakers. So if they have this mindset, this perspective, the reforms will follow, and the reforms that will be definitely part of the negotiation, but also reforms that move the effectiveness and of the decision-making system and the sovereignty to a different level. This is and in this sense, it is a work in progress. And this is the reason why I'm replying to you. This is a work in progress. The only hope is that we hope to have time for implementing this work in progress. Because by postponing, at a certain point, the time is. And you know, when you don't make a decision, at a certain point, the facts impose decision. And not necessarily the facts are welcome. Or positive, whatever. This is the point. About your question about if they influence the political, yes, in a sense, I'm giving you the answer with this. Yes, definitely, they influence, because since we are increasingly interdependent, it's obvious that the more the policymakers are just closing their own horizon within their own space of the national state, they deepen the crisis of the European Union and of their own country. Because then how can you compete internationally? And how can you resist in this context? It's obvious that this implies to think in a different way. And this is not easy. I understand this. Because imagine again the polarization within the population. As I mentioned before, there are social strata, and you are belonging to these social strata. Students, people that in the future will speak more languages, will move within Europe with a different mentality, and people living in the countryside, in the periphery of the cities, speaking just one language, maybe a local dialect, and they cannot understand what is going on in the world. This polarization will be cross-national rather than national. And this will have a tremendous impact prospectively. And this explains to you why racism, because these are, in a sense, not only violent ideologies, but they are also some sort of wrong defense, let's say, from a context that people do not understand. And this is something, again, that politics should clarify. Otherwise, the crisis will deepen. So this. As for religions, if we are speaking about the process that led Yugoslavia to the dismemberment, religion played a very marginal role in all this, because this was a political decision of the communist leaders, because at the time they were communists. Religions interfere later on. They interfere in deepening the divisions. And this is true for all of them. I know because both the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, particularly these two, but later on Islam in Bosnia, they deepened because they interfere significantly into politics. Personally, I remain very disturbed to read in even recently, last year, 2 years ago, the bishops in Croatia that were expressing during national or religious festivity into the churches, making political speeches, saying, addressing their own vision to the government. This is quite surprising in a sense, because this shows an interference of the religion into the political sphere that should be different. Particularly if you consider the framework and the relevance of secularization within the values of the European Union. Considering the fact that we have increasingly more religions and religions prescription within one society rather than the past. This is again what I have mentioned, the identification of one religion and one state. Then even the process of secularization was between a state and one religion. But it's no more the situation. In Italy, we have different religions. And you know that the second religion of Italy is not Islam, as the majority of people think, but the Orthodox Church. Because of the fact that we have lots of immigrants from Ukraine, from Belarus, from Bulgaria, Romania. We have even Uniats in Italy. We never had this in Italy in the past. So this is something that shows you that this plurality of religion, of the plurality of religious prescriptions, require a different, not only different behavior between the political instances and the religious instances, but also among religions in their own relationships. Otherwise, the society could be let's say, the peace within the society would be affected. So I don't think that the Yugoslav war was the result of the clash of civilization. Just to make clear the answers, I reject completely this vision. In my view, was different. Was a deliberate choice for building in a different way nation states under different criteria. Redefining the sense of belonging and the sense of identity of the groups by redrawing maps with a problematic impact for the future of Europe if you follow this reasoning. Just to give you another example that might be problematic. If you read carefully the speech of Putin when Crimea joined, when he was in Crimea after the annexation, he mentioned the fact that Germany didn't understand that Russia was asking to do what Russia allowed Germany to do, because Russia allowed Germany to unify. Why Germany now opposed the Russia to unify? But can you imagine what can be the impact of these rules if you apply all over Europe? This is one of the key points in this sense, rather than the role of religions. It's true that then religions can, in certain deepen the conflict if they, but they also oppose civic values. Some of the civic values. For instance, in Italy, they are strongly against the reforms, the law reforms connected to the family, and even they oppose even laws, anti-discrimination laws against homosexuals. So, and this is something that Italy is one of the rare countries where we don't have any laws against discrimination towards homosexuals or different people, so we don't have. So they are not protected at all. So this is something, in this case, religions play a role. Not only in this sense, because there are also other aspects, for instance, in social solidarity or in fighting against mafia, there are components of religion that are very active. So there are positive and negative elements, if you want to see from this point of view. And so it's not just one element that is directed. But I would not say that because Serbia is Orthodox and Croatia is Catholic, there is this polarization. Also Greece and Bulgaria and Romania are Orthodox Church, and they are Orthodox, and they are in the European Union, part of the European Union, because the European Union is in the Balkans. Because, as we said, Greece is in the Balkans. Geographically, at least, it seems to me that this is in the Balkans, yeah? And so the European Union is in the Balkans since the moment when Greece joined the European Union, yeah? And Bulgaria and Romania, additionally.
We would like to thank very much Professor Bianchini for a very interesting lecture in which he drew historical analogies between the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the current phase in the European integration. We are particularly grateful because, as you obviously saw, he recently had an accident, so this didn't stop him from coming today here and deliver a lecture. And this is much appreciated, and we do hope to have him again soon. Before giving him one warm applause, just to recall that on Monday, at 5 o'clock, we have again one more very influential keynote lecture from Professor Richard Ned-Lebo, a professor in Dartmouth College, King's College London, and Byte Fellow in Cambridge University, on the topic of goodbye Germany. One more applause again to Professor Bianchini.